Good morning to everybody out there in my little podcast world. This is Tony Denton coming to you again from the Phoenix, Arizona area on this July 22nd, 2019. We are finally up to Hebrews chapter 11 in my audiobook installments of my book, Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled. This is lesson number 27 that begins on page 211 if you happen to have the book and are following in it. So let's get on into Hebrews 11, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 3 today. Beginning at chapter 10, verse 19 of Hebrews, and going through the end of the book of Hebrews, Paul wrote of the superiority of Christ's principle, that is faith, to Moses' principle, that is law. The prior section, chapter 10, verses 19 through 39 that we studied, teaches that faith is the proper response to all the superior things of the previous chapters, perfectly setting the stage for the subject of chapter 11 known as Faith's Hall of Fame. Let's look at verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Paul concluded chapter 10 with two thoughts in mind. Firstly, he referred to the idea of God's promise that required faith, chapter 10, verse 36. He had already written a great deal about the promise of an eternal inheritance in chapter 9, verse 15 and other places, which was to include a time of reconciliation, chapter 6, 17 through 20, and a time of respite, chapter 4, verse 1. Beginning in chapter 11, we find him describing faith's relationship to God's promise. In other words, the fact that God had fulfilled every earlier promise should produce the faith that he would fulfill this one. Confer chapter 10, verse 23. Using Abraham as an example in Romans 4, 20 and 21, Paul wrote there that he did not waver at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strengthened in faith, being fully convinced that what he had promised, he also was able to perform. Remember, Paul had discussed at length that that which was real was that which was spiritual, not that which was physical. And he had discussed at length that that which was real was that which was being presently fulfilled, not that which was still being practiced in Jerusalem. Secondly, Paul referred to the idea of living by faith, chapter 10, verse 38. And he went on in chapter 11 to establish this concept by means of many of their own renowned ancestors. Just check out verses 4 through 40. The last verse of chapter 10 was a strong encouragement to not draw back, but to press forward in order to save their souls. Now in chapter 11, he abundantly demonstrated the faith of their predecessors who, for the fulfillment of a promise they never experienced, remained faithful for their ancestors in spite of all sorts of severe difficulties. On the other hand, these brethren were on the verge, chapter 10, verse 1, etc., of experiencing the fulfillment of God's promise. So, in light of their ancestors, they shouldn't even remotely consider forsaking Christ, since that would be a slap in the faces of their fathers. Regarding the term substance here in verse 1, the prefix sub means under, and the base word stance refers to a stand. So substance means that which stands under, hence a foundation. Thus their faith was the ground upon which hope was built. The original word for substance here is translated confidence over in chapter 3, verse 14. The word evidence here means proof. So especially in this context, what they knew of the past concerning their God provided faith for any promise yet unfulfilled. The word seen here means perceived or experienced, translated as perceive in 2 Corinthians 7 verse 8 and experience in verse 5 below. Translated perceive in 2 Corinthians 7, 8 and experience in chapter 11 verse 5 that we'll get to in a few minutes here in Hebrews. So, unlike the things hoped for, which include things of the past and present, check out Romans 8:24, the things not seen include things of the past, present, and future. This brings 2 points to mind. Number one, even if they ignored it, their confessed faith in Jesus as the Christ, chapter 10, verse 23, was evidence concerning whatever they didn't understand about the past, like types and shadows and so on, as well as evidence concerning whatever they couldn't understand about their present, such as their persecution. And number 2, their faith was evidence concerning what they would experience in the future if they just hold on a very, very little while longer. Chapter 10, verse 37. Alright, verse 2. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. The word elders is an antecedent of the ancestors of the Jews to whom Paul was writing, as is evidenced from the lengthy list of them in verses 4 through 40. There's something important that must be remembered here. Paul is writing to Christians who lived during the time prior to AD 70 when God worked supernaturally to bring about what we now possess, namely the promise just discussed. Interestingly, miracles are thought of by God as something for spiritual babies, while that which resulted from them is considered mature and complete. Check out 1 Corinthians 13, 8 through 12. In fact, I even have an entire study on that particular passage on my website, asightforthelord.com. This is broached because verse 2 sets the stage for the rest of the chapter, which deals with several supernatural events that would therefore consistently apply to these brethren who had experienced and were still experiencing such events in their lives. Just check out chapter 2, 1 through 4, and chapter 6, 4 through 6. In other words, they had no excuse but to persevere in their faith just as their fathers did. The phrase, a good testimony, is also translated as well spoken of in Acts 16 verse 2 and as a good reputation in Acts 10:22. And who spoke well of them and gave them this good reputation? God did. He placed His stamp of approval on their lives, lived by faith, by blessing them and by testifying of them in His Word. In fact, every individual to whom Paul alluded in this chapter is found in the Old Testament. It also seems that while verse 3 illustrates the second part of verse 1 about things being unseen, verse 2 illustrates the first part of verse 1 about things hoped for. In other words, as is confirmed throughout this chapter, God blessed those who acted on faith for what they hoped for. Verse 3. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible. As discussed in chapter 1 verse 2, the word world in chapter 10 verse 5 is the Greek term for planet, cosmos, meaning something that was created in an organized, perfect arrangement, like a Swiss watch. The word for world in chapter 1 verse 6 is the Greek term for inhabitants, it's oikumene. And the word for worlds here, as in chapter 1 verse 2, is the Greek term for ages, A-I-O-N, ion. So depending on its context, it goes from planet to an age or the ages of the planet to the inhabitants of an age or the ages of the planet. Besides the reality that ages is undeniably the correct translation here in chapter 11 verse 3, there are other reasons why it should be rendered ages. The word is plural. Not only does worlds make this an unnatural statement, but unless Hebrews is the only place, the Bible never speaks of God creating the worlds plural. But, as already seen, this book does concern two covenant ages, or two covenant worlds, if one prefers to say it that way. Also, since Paul used the Greek term cosmos for the physical creation in chapter 10 verse 5 when he wrote of Jesus coming into the world, then he obviously knew the difference. In fact, there's a clear distinction between these terms in one verse. Chapter 9, verse 26. It says, Jesus would had to suffer often since the foundation of the world, cosmos, but now, once at the end of the ages, eon, He has appeared to put away sin. Even here, chapter 9, verse 26, when Paul wished to express physical creation, he used the word cosmos, not eon. So a synonym for ages in chapter 11 verse 3 would be the word times, as in Ephesians 1:10, where the same apostle wrote of God gathering all together in Christ at the fullness of the times, plural. Besides, the word for framed here in verse 3 isn't from the usual word for created, but from a word which refers to something arranged in a precise manner, which is likely why it's often translated as perfected. So all this would mean that Paul was referring to how God arranged the ages, or the history of human affairs, in such a way as to achieve His spiritual purposes for us. In fact, If a person thinks about it logically enough, he can actually see that God and His Word aren't concerned with the natural history of mankind in general, or even with the history of the Hebrews, but with the redemptive history of man, always pointing toward and focusing on the spiritual as opposed to the physical. Interestingly, the Jews, those who believed in two primary ages, the Mosaical age and the Messianic age, equated the coming of the Christ, to which Paul had just referred in chapter 10, verse 37, with the changing of ages, ages that were ordered and arranged by God Himself. Again, check out my notes on chapter 1, verse 2. The phrase, the Word of God, literally reads, a word of or from God. And the term for word here is not the usual logos, but it's rhema, as in chapter 1, verse 3, referring to a command, thus meaning that everything in redemptive history occurred by and at God's command and according to His authoritative arrangement or plan, no man being able to thwart it. The word made here in verse 3 is from the term translated come to pass or came to pass in the King James Version at least 80 times. And everyone knows what this language indicates, the passing of time. By the way, not only did God arrange these things, that is, these ages, by His rhema, but also, as discussed in chapter 1, verse 3, Jesus was maintaining them by His rhema. So if this is the meaning here, then what does the last part of this verse mean? In other words, how do the things which are seen and the things which are visible fit in? Well, trying to keep it in context, the word seen is the same term as found in verse 1, where Paul was speaking not about that which may be physically seen with the eye, like the cosmos, but about that which can be perceived or understood with the mind. Furthermore, the phrase are seen literally reads being seen, referring to that which was, in their time, coming into focus, mentally. Before this time, things were types and shadows. That is, they were out of focus, not clear. They weren't visible, as Paul used the word here. Check out Ephesians 3 through 5, and 1 Peter 1, verse 12, and some other passages along with that. By faith, and only by faith, they could understand that all of history was orchestrated by God's authority and power to come to pass in the way it did in order to effect man's redemption. Meaning that, since things were a mystery to them, not clear or visible, they could only sense what was being fulfilled in their time by faith. Now that the big picture was before their minds, Paul began his list of ancestor examples, verses 4 through 7, with three men who lived between Eden and the flood, Abel, Enoch, and Noah. So, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained a witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he, being dead, still speaks. Again, concentrate on Paul's primary focus, encouraging these brethren to trust in God and His Word, which included His promises. After all, trust is what faith is. With the sufferings of these Hebrews at the hands of their national brethren in mind, consider the similarities of their situation with that of Cain and Abel, recalling first of all that both sets were brothers. And I have this in chart form on page 216 of the book. On the left side I have Abel and Christian Jews. On the right side I have Cain and non-Christian Jews. Contrasting the left with the right, we have just as by faith Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, so by faith Jewish Christians offer a more excellent sacrifice than their non-Christian brethren. To the right side of that I have, just as Cain killed Abel out of jealousy, 1 John 3:12, so I think we can be assured that many non-Christian Jews were killing their Christian brethren out of jealousy. Back to the left under Abel and Christian Jews, I have, just as Abel's righteousness was God attested, so the righteousness of these Jewish Christians was God attested. Check out chapter 2, 1 through 4 of Hebrews. Now to the right of that, under Cain and non-Christian Jews, I have, just as Abel continued to speak though dead, so the dead of these brethren were still speaking. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, for they rest from their labors, and their works, or their words we could even say, follow them. Revelation 12, verse 13. As a side note here, At another time and to another group of people, this same apostle employed the example of Ishmael and Isaac to picture this identical scenario. Galatians 4:21 through 31. Although what these brethren had endured hadn't yet reached bloodshed, chapter 12, verse 4, Paul's exhortation to these Hebrew Christians was that even if they had reached bloodshed, they could be assured that it wouldn't be for nothing, but they, like Abel, would be approved by God as righteous. For the righteous shall live by faith, chapter 10, verse 38, which is what is the foundation for chapter 11. All right, now chapter 11 of Hebrews, verse 5. By faith Enoch was translated so that he did not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God. When it says Enoch was translated, it means that he was taken from one place, earth, to another place. Check out 2 Kings 2:1 and 11, and John 3 verse 13, etc. Genesis 5:24 simply says, God took him, so that he, like Elijah thereafter, 2 Kings 2:15 through 18, couldn't and wouldn't be found. And he was taken because he pleased God. Genesis 5:22 says that Enoch walked with God, a clause that's described in chapter 6 verse 9 as meaning that he, like Abel, was righteous. Check out a similar notation about Noah at verse 7. Now, consider some similarities here between Enoch and first-generation Jewish Christians. Both lived in very sinful times, Genesis 6:1, Acts 2:40. Both were the ones who pleased God, both were God-approved, and both escaped God's wrath. Enoch was taken before the flood, while these Christians were taken before Jerusalem's demise, in the sense that they heeded Jesus' warnings and left town, Matthew 24:37 through 41. Now here's a disclaimer for you though. In Matthew 24:40 and 41, the term taken refers to the condemned. Check out took in verse 39 of that same chapter. In verses 40 and 41, the Living Oracle's version correctly reads, one shall be taken and the other shall escape. Check out 2 Kings 24:13 and following, and Luke 21:36 as well. Interestingly, Jude, in verses 14 and 15, wrote about Enoch prophesying doom against ungodly people. The word men is not in the original of verse 14 of Jude, indicating the possibility that Enoch was prophesying about the doom of his time that foreshadowed the doom of Jude's time. And surely it isn't just coincidence that Paul went on here in verse 7 to talk about the flood of Noah, Enoch's great-grandson. Back to Hebrews 11:5. Before Paul's additional statement about faith in the next verse, it appears that he was telling his audience that whether they suffered death by their Jewish brethren, like Abel, or were allowed to live through the events of AD 70, like Enoch, chapter 10, verse 37, God would still bless them if they, like Enoch and Abel, remained diligent. All right, moving on to verse 6. But without faith it is impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. Perhaps just in case these brethren didn't catch the point that Enoch's pleasing walk with God was, and only could have been, by faith, he guaranteed them that it's impossible to please God without faith. The phrase to please is in the aorist tense, emphasizing the word impossible to mean that without faith it is impossible to please God at all or in any way. Paul put it more succinctly to the Romans when he said that whatever is not from or of faith is sin, Romans 14:23. Anyone who desires a relationship with God must believe two things. Number one, that God exists, and number two, that he's trustworthy. In other words, just as he rewarded Enoch, he'll reward those who are faithful to him, in spite of how things seem to be going for them. Check out 2 Peter 3, verses 4 and 9. All right, last verse in this study, verse 7. By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. The things not yet seen refer to things that had never been experienced before his time. In other words, although this warning from God to Noah may have been 120 years in advance, Genesis 6:3, His faith in God motivated him to obey those instructions. Due to this, of these first three men, Noah is perhaps the greatest example of persevering faith. According to Peter, Noah condemned the world merely by being a preacher of righteousness, 2 Peter 2 verse 5, who, according to Paul, thus became an heir of righteousness. Lastly, consider some similarities between Noah and first-generation Jewish Christians. Both lived in very sinful times, Genesis 6:1 and Acts 2:40. Both were divinely warned of things not yet seen, Matthew 24. Both were prepared for imminent destruction. Per Eusebius, no Christians were killed in Jerusalem's obliteration. Both warned their worlds of imminent destruction, and both were heirs of God's rewards. Okay, so now, at this point, now that we've finished verses 1 through 7 in the commentary section of my book, we're going to move to page 319, where I'm going to share with you my translation of these verses. Faith provides confidence for our expectations and rationale for those things that aren't yet being experienced. And by such faith, men of old were commended. By faith, we understood that the ages have been orchestrated by God's direction in such a way that what we're looking forward to won't be of things that are visible. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain. Due to such faith, he was commended by God for being righteous when his gifts were accepted. In addition, because of his faith, he, though dead, is still speaking today. By faith, Enoch was transported so as to not experience death, which is why his body was nowhere to be found. God took him, and he was taken because, leading up to that event, he had been commended for being well-pleasing to God. See, without faith it's impossible to please him at all. For it's essential for the one approaching God to believe that he exists and that he's becoming a rewarder of those who are earnestly seeking him. By faith, Noah, having been divinely warned about events yet to be seen and having been a cautious man, carefully constructed an ark for the salvation of his household. In addition, by means of his faith, he condemned the world and became the heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. So, that's it for today's installment of my audiobook of my book, Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled, looking at chapter 11, verses 1 through 7 of Hebrews. Thank you so much for your time today, being with me again this week, and I hope you have a great week and look forward to sharing with you the next section of chapter 11 in next week's installment of my audiobook.